I really think that if we don't try to actively keep it, that especially here in America, we're going to lose it and we won't be able to pass it down to future generations. Now, obviously knitting has really deep historical roots. If you knew how to knit, you probably learned from your mother, who learned from her mother, who learned from her mother, and also men were primary knitters. In early American culture, families relied on handmade garments for warmth and practicality. If you've ever read the Little House series, then you know this to be true. Their winters were rough because they didn't have heat. And knitting was not just a craft. It was a way of life, it connected families, and it even connected communities. And I really think that understanding this history helps us appreciate the value of keeping this tradition alive. Learning to knit has a lot of benefits. I talk about those benefits all the time when it comes to teaching our kids to knit, but those come for us too. We can all benefit from learning to knit and keeping that alive. And not only is knitting really good for us as individuals, but it's also a really powerful way to strengthen our family bonds. When we teach children or our grandchildren to knit, it's creating opportunities of real, pure quality time and shared experience. It allows for a lot of laughter and coming together, even though knitting can sometimes drive you crazy, and just passing down the valuable skills and all the different stories associated with the craft, but also in the doing, in the being together of the craft. When you're integrating knitting into your family traditions, we really have a sense of connection. Now, in today's fast-paced world, it's so important to find ways that really celebrate and revive knitting. So when you join local knitting groups, when you participate in online communities, you can help keep the craft alive. We have the internet. There are so many ways to reach other people, and sometimes it feels like we're so disconnected that we can't pass on this skill to each other when really all it is a button away. You can teach somebody else how to knit and it's alive. So now, speaking to those who know how to knit, this is our task. We need to not be gatekeepers to knitting. There are so many places to learn to knit, online, in books, but we kind of have lost the community part of knitting. So hosting a knitting group just to teach people to knit, or getting together and having a knitting club just to knit and talk together to enjoy and celebrate knitting. And those are the in-person things. That's not to say that we can't do anything online. There's tons of things we can do online to keep this going. And one of those is social media. I know we all have different views on social media, but it's a really good way to reach other people and have a broad audience, whether it's local, whether it's across the country, and make knitting accessible and enjoyable and understandable to all, because so many people I meet want to know how to knit, but they've never learned. They don't know anybody who knits, and they don't know how. Yes, you can pull up a YouTube video, but unless you have that personal connection, some people aren't willing to cross into the knitting world. Okay, so here are some practical tips for passing down knitting skills. One is start with simple projects that are easy to learn and super rewarding. Don't start with a blanket. Don't start with a blanket because it's going to take months to finish probably. I really recommend starting with smaller projects, a dishcloth, maybe a scarf if it's children and they're like, why do I need a dishcloth? Are you asking me to go do more chores because I don't want to do that? Start with something small that's going to take pretty fast. Starting with just the knit stitch and knitting flat are really good ways to pass on knitting to other people who are just beginning. Use resources like Instagram, like Facebook groups, like Ravelry.com, things that are very social online. Start a YouTube page. Do all these things to bring knitting to people who don't know anything about knitting. And then I really suggest encouraging patience and practice and make the learning process enjoyable, because nobody's going to stick with something if somebody was, nagging on them to go. But when we have a really supportive environment, then I think the knitting skills are going to stick. So by learning and teaching and sharing this awesome tradition, this timeless tradition, we are honoring our past and we are enriching our future. It's not just going to fizzle off and just be something we read about in history books. So let's continue to knit together, celebrate this art, and keep our culture alive.